There are stories not meant for the light, whispers echoing from distant shadows where time seems to stand still, and truth becomes elusive. The Book of Enoch unveils a realm where the divine and mortal intertwine, a world of fallen angels, forbidden oaths, and fearsome giants that shake the very foundations of creation. Not all light is pure, nor is every shadow silent. Have you ever wondered what happens when sacred beings cross their divine boundaries? Each page whispers forbidden secrets, warning of the peril that comes with knowledge beyond human grasp. The oaths sworn on Mount Hermon, the rise of the Nephilim, and their insatiable thirst for blood are not mere tales but grave warnings from the distant past. What truly unfolded when darkness prevailed? And what awaits us at the fragile boundary between life and destruction? These unanswered questions linger within the pages, beckoning you into a world unfit for the faint-hearted. Welcome to Why the Book of Enoch Was Banned, Part 1. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the thrilling Part 2 coming soon. There are ancient stories that transcend the boundaries of time, retold as haunting prophecies, carrying both warnings and hope. Among them is the story of Enoch, whose blessings became a symbol of both life and death. Enoch was a righteous man who was granted visions by God that surpassed human understanding. Yet, his words were not written for his own time, but reserved for a distant future. For a generation he foretold would face a great tribulation when the wicked and godless would be eradicated, and the chosen would stand firm amidst destruction. Enoch once declared, "The great Holy One will come forth from his dwelling." In his vision, it was a scene both magnificent and terrifying. The eternal God descending from the heavens, treading upon the earth and Mount Sinai, shaking the very fabric of existence. His power was beyond comprehension, not merely his presence but a display of supreme authority. All people, from rulers to the watchers, beings who once deemed themselves untouchable, trembled in fear. Terror swept across the earth, stretching to its furthest corners. Even the mighty mountains, steadfast through eons, could not endure his strength. They quaked and melted like wax before a blazing fire. The high hills crumbled, and the earth, the foundation of life, was torn apart like a fragile cloth. Everything on the earth was laid waste. This was no random destruction, but a deliberate judgment against all sin and unrighteousness. Yet, amidst the storm of destruction, Enoch saw the light of salvation. In his vision, the righteous and the chosen would not share the fate of the wicked. They would be shielded by the hand of God, spared not only from death, but also blessed abundantly. He would establish peace with them, leading them out of chaos and illuminating their path with his divine light. Enoch proclaimed that they would belong to the Lord and would thrive, living in peace and receiving every blessing promised by him. This was more than a blessing. It was an assurance that even in destruction, souls would be redeemed, living eternally in his light. In contrast, the wicked would find no refuge. The Holy One would not come alone, but with tens of thousands of his holy ones, bringing light and the power of judgment. This light was not gentle but blinding and fierce, exposing everything the darkness had concealed. The blasphemous words and inhumane deeds of the ungodly would be laid bare before him. No excuses could hide their guilt. They would quake before the light, knowing there was no escape. Imagine this scene: the skies ablaze, the earth shattered, and countless sinful souls dragged into the light to face the unchanging truth. Their terror was not merely fear of death, but fear of confronting their deeds. History has seen rulers who believed they were invincible beyond any judgment. Yet, in Enoch's vision, no one, no matter how powerful, could escape the wrath of the Holy One. Even the Watchers, The fallen angels, once wielding immense power, trembled before him. They had once prided themselves on surpassing human limits. But now, before the Holy One, they were nothing more than pitiable souls caught in the whirlwind of judgment. Enoch's words are not merely a warning, but a profound reminder. He spoke not only of destruction, but also of hope, of righteous souls who dared to stand firm amidst the storm of destruction. They were not perfect, but they were courageous enough to believe in the light and live righteously. For them, the day of tribulation was not a day of fear, but a day of redemption, when the light of God would pierce the deepest darkness. Enoch once said, "Behold, he comes with 10,000 of his holy ones." This was not just a prophecy, but a promise that even in the darkest moments, light endures. Even when destruction reigns, there remains a path to peace. The righteous need not fear, for they belong to the Lord. His light will guide their way, and his peace will cover them like an impenetrable armor. Enoch's blessing was not only for the generations of old, but also for us. Within each of us lies a choice, to live in the light or to succumb to the darkness. It is not an easy choice, but it carries profound significance. Judgment Day is not the end, but a new beginning. A beginning where those who dare to believe and live righteously will dwell in eternal light under the sheltering wings of the Holy One. In the vast expanse of the heavens, where radiant stars illuminate the deep darkness of the universe, a perfect order operates ceaselessly. Look up, and you will see the stars, tiny, mysterious points of light, rising and moving along their ordained paths, never straying from the course set for them. For thousands of years, the stars have been like silent sentinels of the sky, appearing, vanishing, and reappearing precisely in their appointed seasons. Something is enchanting and wondrous about this absolute adherence. No deviation, no change, as if an invisible power holds the reins of the cosmos, compelling everything to obey. But the heavens are not the only domain where order prevails. Look down to the earth, where, since the dawn of time, all things seem to carry out their purposes with an uncanny stability. The earth, steadfast in its appearance, endures raging storms, volcanic eruptions, and catastrophic earthquakes. Though its surface may be torn apart by natural forces, the earth continually renews itself, maintaining order amidst chaos. Every mountain, every river, every grain of sand is a small fragment of the grand design that God has carefully constructed. Witnessing its resilience, one cannot help but wonder, how does a world in constant motion sustain such remarkable balance? And then, consider the flow of seasons. In summer, the air is filled with life, trees adorned in vibrant green, and the earth seems eager to absorb every ray of sunlight. In winter, the scene transforms completely, blanketed in snow, enveloped in thick mist as if time has paused. Yet even in this stark contrast, there remains an unchanging rhythm. Rains come and go in cycles, and clouds quietly gather and dissolve into refreshing droplets. Morning dew settles gently on the ground, wrapping everything in a veil of mystery. It follows a symphony composed by the hand of the Creator, leaving us in awe of the universe's flawless intricacy. In this profound stillness, a question echoes: how could all of this exist without a supreme power, an unseen guiding force? Are the wonders we observe truly random, or are they evidence of a supernatural design far beyond human comprehension? When you gaze at the stars or the earth, when you feel the chill of winter or the heat of summer, ask yourself, is it all a coincidence? Or is it a message sent from a place far greater than we can imagine? Winter arrives, draping the earth in a cold shroud, immersing everything in an eerie stillness. Amid this scene, a striking phenomenon emerges. Nearly all trees succumb to winter's fury. withering and shedding the vibrant green cloak they once wore during the warmer days. Bare, skeletal branches stretch toward the gray sky like withered hands, grasping for something beyond their reach. Yet, amidst this desolation, a mystery stands out. Among the faded forest, some trees remain resilient, their leaves intact, standing silently as guardians of time's secrets. Look closer, and you will find exactly 14 trees that do not shed their leaves. Their foliage endures the harsh winter, clinging steadfastly to the branches for 2 or even 3 years before being replaced by new growth. What makes these trees so different? Why, when all others succumb to decay, do they retain their vitality? Are they evidence of a miracle, or do they hold an ancient secret yet to be uncovered by mankind? These trees, with their unyielding persistence, are more than natural phenomena. They carry profound symbolism. They evoke the image of constancy in a world of perpetual change, a mysterious order that only those who dare to question can discern. In a world where winter, the emblem of cold and destruction, brings endings to all, these trees defy that pattern as if shielded by an unseen hand. History has often pointed to the wonders hidden within nature, but these 14 trees seem to transcend even those marvels. In the Book of Enoch, the image of trees that do not shed their leaves serves as a reminder that even when all things appear to perish, there are truths that endure, defying the laws of nature. It is as though they whisper a warning. Amidst the chaos and change of the world, there are things unshakable, decreed by a higher power. Summer, when the sun seems to reign supreme, is when the universe displays its terrifying power. Imagine a bright summer day, with the sun at its zenith, casting its fierce rays upon the earth. At first glance, that light appears to symbolize life and vitality. But as you linger, as the heat intensifies without relenting, it transforms from a source of life to an agent of destruction. The ground steams, stones grow scorching, and even the air carries the parched breath of fire. At that moment, no one can ignore the sun's overwhelming power, a force capable of consuming the entire world. In summer, shade becomes a precious refuge sought by all to escape the sun's wrath. Yet even under the canopy of trees or within the shelter of caves, the heat seeps through skin, filling every breath with its oppressive presence. The ground grows so hot that no one dares to tread barefoot. Every step on the cracked earth or searing stones becomes a test of human endurance, where, in an instant, the heat can scorch the flesh. And yet, amidst it all, one undeniable truth emerges. Summer, with its relentless heat and blazing light, is not merely a season. It is a vivid testament to the unchallengeable authority of nature. In his mystical visions, Enoch described this phenomenon not just as a natural event, but as a powerful reminder. He declared that the sun, with its blinding brilliance, is not merely an unthinking ball of fire in the heavens. It is a symbol of judgment, an instrument in the hands of the Creator to test humanity. The summer scene, with the sun burning fiercely, serves as an image of a supernatural power far beyond human control. It reminds us that no matter how hard we strive, we remain small beings in a world governed by incomprehensible forces. For millions of years, the earth has thrived under an unshakable order, where every being in creation fulfills its purpose. From vast forests adorned with lush greenery and branches heavy with fruit to rivers tirelessly flowing without end, everything abides by the immutable laws set forth by the Everlasting One. Observe closely, and you will see that every leaf, every drop of water, and every heartbeat on this planet performs its duty without deviation. Year after year, generation after generation, they remain unwavering in their purpose. Yet, in contrast, humanity, gifted with intellect and free will, fails to maintain this divine order. Enoch, in his prophetic visions, described how mankind has turned away from the Creator. They reject His commandments, abandon their loyalty, and speak words of arrogance and blasphemy from impure lips. Their hearts are hardened, their souls darkened, and thus they cannot find peace. Humanity, driven by ambitions that defy the Creator's boundaries, brings a curse upon itself. Their days will be ruined, their years marked by suffering, and their fate sealed in eternal condemnation. In this haunting vision, Enoch saw the fate of the wicked, cursed by their deeds. Their names will become a curse to all righteous generations. The godless and sinful will stand as symbols of failure and destruction, shunned and despised by all. They will not escape judgment, nor will they find mercy. For them, there is no forgiveness, no salvation, only eternal darkness and the weight of an everlasting curse. But not all is darkness. In Enoch's prophecy, the chosen ones appear as a radiant light amidst the storm. They are the righteous souls, the humble ones who abide by the Creator's order. For them, there will be light, joy, and peace. They will inherit the earth, live in salvation, and bask in divine goodness. Sin and pride will no longer touch them. Wisdom will be bestowed upon them, guiding them on paths of humility and integrity. They will not merely live but dwell in peace, eternal joy, and multiplied blessings throughout their days. This prophecy presents a stark contrast. The wicked will remain in eternal curse, while the righteous will live in light and peace. It is not merely a warning but also a promise that for those who embrace humility and obey the Creator, there awaits a future filled with hope and glory. Look at the oceans and rivers. They fulfill their purpose unfailingly, never deviating. Waves crash upon the shore, and rivers carry water tirelessly to the sea as though guided by an unseen hand. Their absolute loyalty to the commands they have received serves as a model of obedience. Yet humanity, with all its self-proclaimed power, fails to do the same. They break the order, turning away from the greatness of the everlasting one. And for this, they must bear the consequences. Enoch's vision foretells not only destruction but also immense hope for the chosen. Those who live with faithfulness and humility will have nothing to fear. They will live their days in eternal joy and peace. All suffering, all wrath, will pass away, and they will be blessed with a salvation that cannot be taken from them. This prophecy resonates through time like a sad yet powerful song. It reminds humanity that every choice leads them to stand between light and darkness. That choice, whether the path of pride or humility, determines an unchangeable destiny. There will be years of curse or years of joy, but it all depends on how humanity chooses to live under the hand of the Creator. In the eternity of the universe, Enoch's prophecy echoes like a bell, calling humanity to acknowledge its responsibility to the divine order to which it belongs. In the early days of mankind, when the earth was shrouded in mystery and the shadows of untold secrets, the children of humanity multiplied and spread across its face. The daughters of men grew in beauty and grace, their allure captivating and radiant. Yet, amidst this brilliance, a deep darkness began to stir. It was not mortal men who were first enchanted but the angels, the sons of heaven, who allowed their hearts to succumb to forbidden desires. From their lofty heights, where they had once served as guardians of creation, they looked down, and temptation took hold. The divine light within their eyes turned into a dark flame, consuming their pride and virtue. "Come," a voice among them declared, its tone laden with sin. "Let us choose wives from among the children of men and beget offspring." These words, fleeting yet powerful, unleashed an unstoppable tide of change. Their leader, Simjaza, felt the immense weight of this plan. He gazed ahead, foreseeing the consequences that awaited them, a sin that would not only alter their fate but fracture the very order decreed by the Creator. With doubt and fear deep in his eyes, he spoke, "I fear you will not truly commit to this deed, and I alone will bear the burden of this great sin." But the other angels, enthralled by the thought of this forbidden union, were unmoved by his warning. They exchanged fiery, resolute glances and spoke their oaths, not mere words but binding, dreadful curses. "Let us swear," they said, "and bind ourselves with mutual curses so no one may abandon this plan. We will do this." These oaths, echoing in the shadows, began a chilling new chapter in human history. It was not just a transgression of boundaries between angels and mankind, but an outright rebellion against the Creator's divine order. The oaths, sealed with curses, became an unbreakable burden. Even Semjaza, fully aware of the consequences, was swept into the vortex of rebellion. The majestic, towering angels, once sacred protectors of heaven and earth, now gathered, their eyes no longer radiant but darkened by lust. Their figures descended to the earth, where innocent humanity lived, unaware that their fate was about to be irreversibly altered. In that moment, the glory of heaven seemed to falter, giving way to an unfathomable darkness. This is not merely a tale of a fall, but an eternal mark upon human history. It raises profound questions about the boundaries between the divine and the mortal, the power of desire, and the fragility of sacred order. Why did these angels, created to uphold harmony, choose a path of destruction? Was it the light of humanity, the vitality and beauty they could never possess, that stirred their envy and longing? Or was it an inherent weakness within their nature, a trial they were destined to fail? Though veiled by time, history and legend leave traces. These oaths of rebellion set into motion a chain of catastrophic events, culminating in the rise of the Nephilim, hybrid beings born of angels and humans, imbued with immense strength and burdened with a legacy of sorrow. Yet, at this moment, as the angels stood on the precipice between choice and destiny, one can only gaze into the swelling darkness and ask, what truly drove them to make that fateful decision? On the summit of Mount Hermon, beneath the shadow of a moonless night, a secret gathering took place, a dark milestone in history marking the fall of the divine. It was the era of Jared when the angels, the sons of heaven, abandoned their loyalty to the Creator. 200 mighty angels, shrouded in silence, gathered with eyes heavy with determination and forbidden desire, making a decision that would forever alter creation. Mount Hermon, often veiled in thick clouds, now bore witness to a forbidden oath. Semjaza, their leader, stood at the forefront, conducting a fearsome ritual. Words of curses, imbued with sacred power and destruction, echoed through the air. All 200 angels swore in unison, binding themselves with unbreakable promises, tying their fate to the darkness they had chosen. They named the mountain Hermon, for there they had sworn their oath and cast an indelible shadow upon the earth. Their names resonated like otherworldly echoes, each carrying its power and curse. Semjaza, the supreme leader, was the first to step across the boundary of rebellion. Arakelba, Ramiel, Kokablel, Tamlil, each name was uttered, forming the pieces of a sinful conspiracy. The other angels, including Ezekiel, Barakijel, Asael, and Armoros, were bearers of heaven's light who chose instead to immerse themselves in the darkness of their desires. Ananel, Zakiel, Samsapil, Sataril, Turil, Jamjul, and Sariel, 19 names, 19 figures, each a commander of the fallen. The assembly of 200 angels was more than a mere gathering. It was a formidable force, each member possessing unimaginable power. But this power meant to preserve and protect was instead wielded to shatter divine order. Their choice did not only condemn themselves but also opened a gateway for dark entities to enter the realm of humanity. This moment marked the beginning of the Nephilim, hybrid beings born of angels and humans, wielding terrifying strength and carrying the weight of an ominous legacy. The earth, once a realm of peace where humanity lived under the shelter of divine order, was forever changed when shadows from heaven descended upon the world. The angels, once divine beings bearing light, were lured by the beauty and allure of the daughters of men. Overcome by desire, they crossed the forbidden boundary, choosing wives from among humans. Step by step, they not only mingled with humanity but cast a looming darkness over all creation. These fallen angels did not merely dwell among men. They defiled themselves and the women they chose. Through this union, they not only violated the Creator's laws, but also brought forbidden knowledge, secrets meant only for the heavens. They taught mankind to use charms, enchantments, and mystical arts to manipulate nature. They revealed how to cut roots for sorcery and unveiled secrets hidden within the trees. Sacred knowledge, meant to preserve the universe's balance, now became a tool to sow chaos and fuel ambition. From this forbidden union emerged a new race, the Nephilim, giants whose size and power defied imagination, standing at heights of up to 3,000 ells, equivalent to over 4.000 meters in ancient measures. They were no ordinary beings. They embodied strength beyond human comprehension and heralded an approaching nightmare. These giants were not only colossal in stature, but possessed an insatiable hunger. At first, they consumed all that humanity could provide: grain, fruits, livestock. Everything vanished beneath their massive hands. But when resources dwindled and nothing was left to eat, their true nature was revealed. They turned on humanity, the beings who had brought them into existence. The scene descended into horror as the giants hunted humans, devouring them one by one. No longer revered as supernatural marvels, they became harbingers of destruction, spreading terror wherever they went. But their hunger did not end there. They ravaged the natural world, preying on birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish. They not only hunted but corrupted all they touched, defiling creation itself. In their bloodthirsty frenzy, they even turned on each other, committing acts so vile that even the deepest darkness shuddered. At the peak of their iniquity, they drank blood, a final, blasphemous act against divine law. Blood, the symbol of life, became the substance that fed their savage thirst. As chaos reached its zenith, the earth itself could bear no more. The land, rivers, and mountains seemed to cry out, accusing the lawless beings. The earth's cries were not mere protests but warnings of an inevitable reckoning. Nature, once a harmonious part of the divine order, had become a battlefield for darkness and destruction. Never before had humanity witnessed such horror. The Nephilim, born from the forbidden union of angels and mankind, were not just a mistake. They were the embodiment of rebellion. They were the consequence of desires that exceeded divine boundaries, a dark stain etched permanently into the earth's memory. Their fate, like that of the fallen angels, could only lead to destruction. But this destruction was not confined to them. It served as a grim reminder that any being, whether divine or mortal, who defied sacred laws would face judgment. The measurement of 3,000 ells, their unimaginable size, was more than just a number. It symbolized greed, the breaking of all limits, and a power beyond control. Yet more terrifying was the transformation of the world around them. Humanity, once living in harmony with nature, now faced a threat that surpassed all comprehension. The existence of the Nephilim not only endangered human lives, but shook the very foundation of the earth itself. The story of the fallen angels and the Nephilim is not merely one of destruction. It is a dire warning about the consequences of crossing forbidden boundaries. When knowledge is abused and desire overtakes reason, darkness rises to consume all within reach. The earth, with all its life and beauty, was turned into a domain of death, and its cries were a final plea to restore balance. Yet the question remains, can order be restored, or has darkness fully consumed everything? In the Book of Enoch, this chapter is not just a recounting of the past, but a forewarning for the future. It reminds us that, no matter how great the power, crossing divine boundaries always leads to devastating consequences. And as the thick darkness looms, we cannot help but wonder, are we too nearing that boundary where light and darkness collide and destruction begins anew? There are ancient stories passed down not to explain but to warn. In the Book of Enoch, whispers from the shadows unveil a world where fallen angels reign, desires take control, and destruction consumes all. The curses sworn upon Mount Hermon, the birth of the bloodthirsty Nephilim, and the forbidden knowledge spread among humanity paint a hauntingly dark picture. Yet, hidden within lies a lesson not meant for the faint-hearted. What happens when divine order is broken? This lesson is not merely a warning from the past, but a reflection on the present. In a world constantly grappling with ambition and the abuse of power, we are reminded that pride, greed, and the crossing of sacred boundaries inevitably lead to chaos. Light can only prevail when the sanctity of divine limits is upheld. These boundaries are not restrictions, but shields protecting us from the encroaching darkness. Will we possess the humility to remain in the light, or will we cross the threshold and face the inevitable consequences? Please subscribe to our channel to enjoy more captivating Bible stories from us.